Hi, you guys. Welcome back. And of course, if you are new to this channel, welcome. My name is Tracey, and in this episode of Magical Monday, I'm going to tell you all about Leprechaun folklore. So stay tuned. Many people see leprechauns as like the Lucky Charms leprechaun on the cereal box, or like the Notre Dame leprechaun mascot for the Fighting Irish, or some people even see leprechauns as the mascot for the Celtics, which is Lucky the Leprechaun. The leprechaun is probably the most famous of all of the earth fairies. The leprechaun is an Irish fairy with much folklore and many stories revolving around sightings of the leprechaun. So the leprechaun is an earth fairy, therefore this is actually a creature of the Fae realm, which is the realm in which fairies exist. So technically a leprechaun is a fairy. And in some folklore, it even states that the leprechaun is actually a mix between a water sprite and another fairy of households, which actually lives in people's cellars and drinks too much. So those two got together and created the leprechaun. And so the leprechaun is generally a male fairy creature who lives alone and who is a shoemaker or a cobbler. So the sound that some people claim to hear right as they are about to witness a leprechaun is the slight tapping sound of the cobbler's hammer hammering nails into shoes. So leprechauns are small, around 3-foot men who are generally loners and busy themselves making and mending shoes, and also protecting their pot of gold, which is said to be found at the end of a rainbow. Leprechauns are generally very mischievous creatures, so you have to be careful if you ever contact a leprechaun, and be very careful on what that leprechaun, what types of deals that they make with you. Very much of the mythology around the leprechaun is that if a human captures the leprechaun and does not take their eyes off of it, then the leprechaun will lead them to their pot of gold. Now, if you can find the pot of gold without losing sight of the leprechaun, then the gold is yours. But the leprechaun is usually very clever and sneaky and will always find a way to win unless they like you. So I have 2 stories about the leprechaun to share with you to illustrate this point. The first story is where the leprechaun does not let the man get the gold. And the second story is where the leprechaun does let the man get the gold. In her encyclopedia called Spirits, Fairies, Leprechauns, and Goblins, Carol Rose actually shares a story about a man who gets a leprechaun to show him the bush in which he is hiding his pot of gold. So in that story, The man captures a leprechaun, and in order to exchange for his freedom, the leprechaun was to show the man which bush it is that he hides his pot of gold. And so the leprechaun leads the man to the bush, which should contain his pot of gold, which it's buried under. And since the man at that time did not have a shovel, he decided to tie a red ribbon on the bush. And so he had the red tied onto the bush and then left to go get a shovel. And as soon as he came back, he realized that now every single bush in the whole area of the forest had a red ribbon tied on it. So the leprechaun tricked him while he was off going to get a shovel to get the treasure out of the bush. The leprechaun then made it so every single bush was then donning the red ribbon, and therefore the man had no idea which bush it was that the leprechaun had led him to earlier. So this tale is obviously telling you to be careful of being greedy and trying to get rich quick, to kind of watch out who you're dealing with in those situations. And then in the second story that I wanted to share with you guys today, I actually found this story in the Fairy Bible by Tracey Morley. And I love this book. It's so cute. And it even has illustrations of the leprechaun. This is like an older look of what the leprechaun was like in the red hat rather than green. So this story has to do with a man named Seamus. And Seamus was actually very intelligent. He loved to read and study, but his family was very poor. So Seamus couldn't really afford to receive the type of education that he really wanted. So one day, Seamus was on his way home from the fields. He had his shovel on one shoulder and a book under his other arm. And suddenly he started to hear a little tapping sound coming from somewhere around him. So when Seamus realized that the tapping was actually coming from the hedge that was growing along his path, he quietly put down his items and snuck over to the bush, parting it very gently. And that is when he spotted a leprechaun sitting in the hedge. And so Seamus, knowing all about leprechauns, very quickly grabbed the little man by the arm, and he said, "I'm not letting you go until you show me where your gold is." "Ah, you're choking me," says the leprechaun. And so Seamus actually kind of released him from the grip that he had around him, but still kept his eye very firmly on the leprechaun. So the leprechaun coughed and straightened up his little green jacket, and he just said, "So, tell me why, you're a nice fella. Tell me why you want to get to my pot of gold so badly." And so Seamus had explained to him his predicament, that he was anxious to get to the pot of gold so that he could finally afford the education that he had always wanted. So after looking Seamus up and down and sizing him up a bit, the leprechaun decided that he believed him and that he actually liked him, because when the leprechaun had stated that he was choking, Seamus was nice enough to release him from his grip. But Seamus did not take his eyes off that leprechaun. And so after he sized him up and realized that he liked Seamus and he decided that he could have some gold, then the leprechaun quickly gave him a sideways glance and went running through the woods. And so Seamus had to keep up with him, making sure not to let the leprechaun out of his sight. And so Seamus even almost fell down a few times because he couldn't even look at the ground because he was so intent on keeping his eyes on the leprechaun that was sprinting through the woods in front of him. Finally, after quite some time, Seamus was very exhausted, and the leprechaun had finally stopped at a barrow mound. So the leprechaun pointed at a crack in the boulder, and he stated, "There you go. My gold is right inside of that boulder." And he said, "But you better be hurrying, because if the sun goes down and you have not come out yet, then the crack in the boulder will close up and you will be stuck inside forever." And so Seamus went inside through the crack in the boulder, and sure enough, there was so much gold, more than he had ever seen before. Seamus realized that he could not pick up the pot of gold. It was far too heavy because it was far too full of gold coins. So Seamus started to place the coins in his pockets and tried to carry them, in all of his pockets in any way he could get as much gold on him as possible. The leprechaun reminded Seamus, "This gold won't do you much good if you cannot use it. Sunset is but a moment away." And just then, Seamus realized he had to hurry up and get out. He tried one more time to lift the giant pot of gold with no luck, and at just the last moment, he leaped through the crack in the boulder and was able to get out just as the sun was setting. Seamus heard the boulder close behind him, and when he looked back, there was no crack in the boulder, and there was no sign of a leprechaun. Seamus hurried home with all of the gold coins that he had received in his coat. And when he got home, his family was so excited and delighted to hear his story and to find that he really had found all of this gold. And soon they were living in a very fine house, and they had servants, and Seamus was able to get the best education he could find, and his pockets were always full of gold coins for the rest of his life. So in that story, you'll realize that if there is a true need, rather than it being based purely on greed, but if there's a true need and desire, then the universe will somehow let you have everything that you need. So the leprechaun is not all good, and he's not all bad. He's a little bit of both, and he is a little mischievous. Well, that about wraps up this episode of Magical Mondays, all about leprechaun lore. And I hope this video was interesting. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like. And of course, if you're a viewer but not yet a subscriber, I would love for you to click subscribe right under this video. And once you're a subscriber, you can then click the bell if you would like to be notified each and every time that I upload a new video. Thank you guys so much for spending your time with me. I love you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.